A federal court judge wants input by the end of the month into whether he has the power to decide how much the government should pay lawyers who successfully pursued an unprecedented lawsuit against Canada for the loss of Indigenous identity suffered by victims of the 60s scoop. The request by Judge Michael Phelan to the lawyers involved comes after Justice Edward Bulobaba, in a separate but parallel proceeding in Ontario Superior Court, threw a legal grenade into the scoop class action settlement by decrying the $75 million Canada had agreed to pay in legal costs as too rich by half. In a scathing decision in June in which he opened up the larger question of how class action lawyers are compensated, Bulobaba also railed at part of the deal under which lawyers who acted in federal court would collect half the fee total, $37.5 million, while the other half would go to the lawyers who had acted in Superior Court. The lawyers who had spent years fighting the landmark case in Superior Court agreed to allow Bulobaba to deal with the fee issue separately. That paved the way for his final approval and implementation of the hard-fought scoop settlement under which survivors are to be paid up to $50,000 each. The lawyers in the federal court action, however, made no such concession. They maintained, and still do, that federal court judge Michelle Shore, who was handling the matter, had signed off on the settlement on May 11, including the fee arrangement he called fair and reasonable. They nevertheless went back to federal court for one more judicial sign-off in light of the change on the Ontario end of the settlement. On August 2, Phelan, who took over the case from Shore, signed an order under which the lawyers in federal court would get their $37.5 million. However, the following day, after Bulobaba had received a copy of the order, Phelan sent a note to the federal court parties in which he said his approval applied to the scoop agreement other than fees. Almost a week later, Phelan questioned whether he could even rule on the fee issue. In light of Justice Shore's decision approving fees, what jurisdiction does the court have to consider the issue? Phelan wrote. In response, lawyer Celeste Paltak with Koski-Minsky in Toronto wrote Phelan to say there never was any new request for the judge to rule on the fees because the amount was already approved by Justice Shore and Your Honor. The letter goes on to point out that no one had appealed Shore's order and, as a result, the fee issue had been finally disposed of. Nevertheless, in a case conference call Thursday, Phelan again asked for submissions before August 31 on his authority to deal with the fee issue, and promised to render a decision within a week or so of that date, said Kirk Burt, another lawyer involved in the case. In the interim, the lawyers acting in Superior Court, Jeffrey Wilson and Morris Cooper, are waiting to see whether their $37.5 million will materialize. They declined to comment on the latest twist but had previously said it would be grossly unfair for them to have to take home less than their federal court counterparts given Bulobaba's criticism. In his decision in June, Bulobaba was effusive in praising Wilson, whose small firm took on enormous risk by filing the case in 2009 and then put in millions of dollars in time without any guarantee of success. Bluntly put, this is as close a case of class counsel begging the firm as I have seen, Bulobaba wrote. At the same time, the judge slammed opportunistic class action lawyers who had acted in federal court, saying he was stunned they had admitted to collecting $10 million in fees for essentially having done not much at all. In all, Bulobaba said, the total legal bill should have been around $37.5 million, half what was agreed to, of which the federal court lawyers deserved no more than $12.5 million. It now remains to be seen whether Phelan makes any changes to the fees and what Bulobaba will decide regardless of what happens in federal court. Sitting in the truck bed as we roll across a small patch of farmland just outside the Saskatoon city limits, the air is refreshingly brisk. But the sun is bright and prairie sky is ever blue above John Coates' farm. Mr. Coate and his wife, Barb, have a little more than 30 hectares, and the crops from their modest farming operation are destined for stills elsewhere on the property, where they produce the vodka, gin and liquors of Black Fox Farm and Distillery. Imagine a locally minded restaurant where a chef heads out to the farmer's market in the morning, He's going to look what's available for the menu that week, and there's 10 beautiful things, Mr. Coate says. He's limited with what he can create sometimes, but that doesn't mean he can't create something beautiful. That's the same thing here. The Coates' family business is one of North America's most sustainable distilleries. Their annual production is approximately 5,000 liters, significantly less than other sustainability-minded operations across Canada such as Eau Claire Distillery in Turner Valley, Alta, or Dillon Small Batch Distillers in Beamsville, Ontario. Black Fox's small size allows the Coates to look to their own land for almost every ingredient needed to produce their line of spirits. The lone exception is the base triticale grain, a wheat rye hybrid that grows just down the road. The distiller's lineup of gin is primarily seasonal, with Mr. Coate harvesting different types of aromatics and botanicals to create different batches of gins at different times of the year. Currently, you'll find a refreshing cucumber and Saskatchewan caraway-infused gin which is not unlike Hendrick's, but, dare I say, with a little more depth. During a recent trip to explore the distillery and its surrounding grounds, Mr. Coate shows me small vats of freshly plucked rose petals and calendula flowers, both of which are grown on-site. The rose petals are going into a run of gin that will be released in the early fall. We typically preserve everything in alcohol, he explains. When you use dry ingredients like florals and what have you, you are using something that has lost a lot of its natural oils, and those oils are what you're looking for in creating a flavorful gin. The Coates' sustainable approach to distilling reaches far beyond simply growing their own. Without connection to city water, they rely on a geothermal cooling system in their production, a looping water system that saves thousands of liters of water a year. Leftover mash is always brought out to the farm and used as fertilizer. There are two kinds of farmers in the world, and it's not non-organic and organic farmers. It's good and bad ones, Mr. Coate jokes. If you have your mind around sustainability, you will always look to see how you can make a process as functional as possible. In Pemberton, BC, Tyler and Lorian Schramm have run Pemberton Distillery for 10 years, but remain modest in production with a slightly larger output than that of Black Fox at 6,000 liters annually. The Schrams also use the environmentally friendly geothermal cooling in their distilling process.